Morning, everyone. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the big conversation, Living and Coping with Trauma, the Unseen Force. I am Diane Davies, chairperson of the Big Conversation Partners in Dismantling Racism and Privilege in Southern Maryland. We all welcome you. We are now 25 partners. Their names are listed in your program and at the end of it. I'd like to welcome our newest partner, Calvert Concept, Workforce Housing and Reconciliation. Before we begin, we want to honor a Big Conversation partner and steering committee member. Many of you knew him and are experiencing the loss that he has left us with. The steering committee member, Hugh Davies, will now introduce this memorial moment. Hugh?
Yes, good morning. Just a little more than a month ago, we lost a foundational member of the Big Conversation, Malcolm Funn. Before we begin the forum, let us take just a few moments to remember Malcolm. Many of you who are joining us today have the same feeling of loss.
Malcolm was a huge factor in the Big Conversation and in Southern Maryland and all of Maryland. And we wanted to take that moment to recognize him and all that he has done for all of us. Now to begin our 9th annual Big Conversation, an opportunity for civil discourse on how national issues affect us locally. This is a place where people can share their stories, listen deeply to one another, and develop trust and understanding in one another. The ability to deliver this program virtually is due to our partners, the Calvert Library, and especially Robin Truslow, and our facilitators, the mediation centers of Calvert, Charles, St. Mary's, and the greater Maryland area. We thank you all for your help. The topic for today comes from you, the participants. This is our 5th Big Conversation addressing racial issues. Today, we will examine trauma, racial trauma. When we began researching trauma almost a year ago, we realized that because of the pandemic, most of us have experienced some degree of trauma. For some, it was fleeting, but for others who have experienced racial trauma daily and for generations. And others of us do not realize that we are traumatized. Some people have referred to trauma as another crisis for this country. What are the reasons behind trauma? We need to name them. We need to understand them. We need to rectify them. How does trauma influence our bodies, our minds, our culture, our souls? Laypersons and community leaders, we all have a part to play. Understanding the impact of trauma and making changes begins by listening deeply to each other, to our stories, and looking into ourselves, examining our systems, and finding answers. Hopefully you all received your digital program. There is a lot of information packed into that. And I would ask you to please use your program as a guide for our agenda for today. Now let us begin with our presentation with our panelists. Each will have 20 minutes to speak to their knowledge and experience of trauma in general and of racial trauma. Participants, please use the chat to pose your questions to each panelist. Hugh Davies will ask your questions once the panel has completed their presentation. Let me present our first panelist. Dr. Camera Jules P. Harold is a professor of psychology at Howard University and has been so for over 30 years. He is a researcher in the field of the effects of stress and racism on the poor health of African Americans. His books and articles linking racism to poor health outcomes are a call to action for policymakers to remedy structural racism. In 2018, Dr. Harold was awarded the National Science Foundation grant. In that, he is examining the multifaceted ways in which African American ethnic identity and racial identity shape the association between racial discrimination experiences and biophysical development during the transition to adulthood. Dr. Harold, welcome to the big conversation. We are honored to have your participation and to learn from you. And it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Would someone signal if they're seeing my screen?
You're good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And again, I believe I met Mr. Fun on my last visit here. I believe that's who I met. And my condolences to the group, because you can tell that was a pivotal person in our work. What I wanted to do today is sort of go over some of the things that are in the program and in the materials that we received, and then just make some comments that might lead to a deeper discussion of where we are on this. So basically, I want us to think a little bit about what we mean when we define trauma. What are we really talking about there? So we'll take that definition apart a little bit, the one from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Administration Services. That was our source of the definition, on our last meeting. I wanted to talk a little bit about the breadth of the effects, and that means that we're going to really look at two lives. I want to look at two lives and recent case studies that tell us a little bit about trauma, I think, and then just a few words at the end about the process of healing before we close out. And this is the old working definition that we've been talking about, and it's in the materials that you received. An event, series of event, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, having lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, and I think this is interesting, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. That three big parts to this one. The first is this event, series of events, or set of circumstances that basically is going to tell us that trauma can be a discrete event or occurrence, or it can be a sustained contextual properties of the environment that we're in. It doesn't necessarily have to be an identifiable event for it to be traumatic. It could be just simply the circumstances in which people find themselves over a period of time. Second was this cagey term experienced, sort of leaves open and I think it was carefully selected, the notion of conscious processing of trauma. We know is sufficient, but it's not necessary to trauma's impact. In other words, trauma can be brought into our lives, both on a conscious level and on a unconscious level, impacting us without our knowledge. And then, of course, the last one is this idea of these adverse effects are quite large and cover a lot of areas. And they, in fact, are getting us to the point of sort of defining trauma, not only in terms of what happens, but in turn from the environmental side, but also what happens from the physical or from the person side. Both are important. Both causes and effects are important as we define trauma. So again, just the reminder there that we're talking about discrete or sometimes sustained contextual events, sometimes consciously processed, and sometimes not so much consciously processed. Again, the summary: trauma, chronic or acute, conscious or unconscious, evident by its stimulus or its effects. All right. Racist trauma, when we talk about racist trauma, we're talking about traumatic events and encounters that are the direct or indirect outgrowth of any of the several forms of racism that exist in society. That if we sort of were to diagram this, there's an overall umbrella process called structural racism, which is when a variety of institutions and processes sort of come together to produce racism in this society. Cultural racism is that reflected in the cultural ethos, which is a very broad umbrella for human activities. And then under that, we would talk about also individual and institutional racism. When we go through definitions of racism, trauma can come from any or all of those sources. And again, just to illustrate, in terms of stridency, you can have sometimes trauma occurring that's pre-conscious, very subtle, to small annoyances to overtly threatening kinds of things on the continuum. And then the chronicity would be this idea of sometimes just a single event would be traumatic in and of itself. And other times we have repeated circumstances and then sometimes extended conditions. Just again, to sort of interrogate that definition we were looking at. What I want to do now is simply talk about two examples of trauma and see if that sort of will stimulate some of our conversation. The first is from a recent book, very helpful book, written by an emergency room physician in Chicago. And it's a fascinating book because he talks about some technical aspects of racism, the ones we've just talked about here, structural racism, individual racism, cultural kinds of phenomena. But then he also talks about its effects, how it plays out in the bodies of people on the south side of Chicago where he works. All right. And eventually in the book, his own mother is taken to the emergency room. And this is all taking place during the recent pandemic. And of course, his mother, he calls ahead and lets all his colleagues know that his mother is experiencing some symptoms. He wants them to watch over what's going on with her. But this is the letter he has to write to her when it's over. He says, "As you know, I love the hospital." But then he said, "But it's not different than any institution. It's a reflection of America. On that day, the day she was seen, you were simply a Black woman on the South Side, treated as so many women on the South Side are handled. The system worked exactly as designed, not because you didn't matter specifically, but because none of us matter enough." What I want us to think about here is the fact that this is an individual with a deep understanding of the dimensions and structures that comprise racism. All right. And that and he knows those on the local, national, and world levels. However, he was helpless to dampen or prevent the effects of racism and in the lives of those people that he holds dearest, including his own his own family. So I refer to him here as a traumatized physician. Fascinating book to read as he goes through a very human kind of encounter with trauma from an individual who really understands the nature of the society and where it's coming from. The second case study I just wanted to mention before we close out is the recent book on Mr. George Floyd. Samuels and Lulu Bonipa are two Washington Post reporters that have just completed this study of the life of Mr. George Floyd. And a quote that's here, and it comes through in the book, and this is toward the very end of his life, in that fatal confrontation, where the police tell him to keep his hands on the steering wheel. And then the authors say that Mr. Floyd now began to employ the lessons he had learned from childhood about how to interact with the police. Yes, sir, he responded, rocking his body back and forth between the steering wheel and the seat. I'm sorry, so sorry. That in this particular instance, you have Mr. George Floyd, who has a deep understanding of how a large Black man should conduct themselves in this society. And he was always deferential to the police, always deferential when he would walk in a room, make sure that no one would feel threatened. So I say a thorough and intellectual and visceral understanding of the physical violence associated with interpersonal manifestations of racism. Mr. Floyd had that, all right, but he found that compliance and submission ultimately failed to halt the slow motion destruction of his body. All right, that when we think of trauma, I just want to insert this thing, just as a little reminder here, that we are talking about the impact on an individual, but wellness and wholeness is not simply the absence of disease. All right, mental and physical health involve both the unfolding and the actualization of our inherent processes and potentials. Trauma interrupts these as well as threatens our bodies. It also interrupts an unfolding process that is quite natural. Naeem Akbar and other humanists out here say that, look, the self is a reflection of life itself. It's organic and it tends toward growth. Movement toward self-knowledge and self-acceptance is natural. Trauma interrupts these. All right. So again, considering outcomes, the effects of trauma can be immediately lethal, very promptly lead to someone's death, or they could lead to sort of a slow motion lethality. And in other cases, trauma will simply alter the trajectory of one's life. The racist trauma can turn one's life path away from growth and enhancement of their own tendencies. All right. For example here, that we know that the old trauma of physical attack, the enslavement, Jim Crow, vulgar racism, these ensured death and destruction of individuals, families, and social systems. The economic disruptions that we see later on, these have resulted in disparities that we call wealth disparities or economic disparities. And these are also a source of trauma in people's lives. Again, just to recognize that the wealth disparities persist to this particular day. All right. What's interesting, though, I think in the recent book on George Floyd is that, in fact, his ancestor, who was that bridge between enslavement and emancipation, Mr. Hillary Thomas Stewart, had been enslaved in North Carolina, but after enslavement, he was able to acquire hundreds of acres of land, as one of the largest landowners, Black landowners in the state. All right, as Black people began to close that gap during the Reconstruction period. All right, the authors tell us that through a series of complex transactions, some of these individual racism, other structural racism, all of them traumatic, Mr. Stewart and his family lost their holdings, their land holdings. And as they say, leaving nothing to his children, including Mr. George Floyd, who comes later on, nothing to those offspring, those people who come after him, but a cautionary tale of his life as a former slave who had once known wealth, but died a pauper. All right. And then, of course, the last thing is that trauma can, in fact, be of a psychological origin. And this is when we have the attacks on cultural memory, cultural racism, the loss of socializing, affirming socializing practices through this. And all of these are traumatic because they disrupt psychological growth and development. All right. As Ta-Nehisi tells us, memory is so important. It is the chariot. Memory is the way. Memory is the bridge from the curse of slavery to the boon of freedom. He puts that statement in Harriet Tubman's voice in his novel, The Water Dancer. All right, just a quick word on treatment. Dr. Frantz Fanon will remind us that there's a complex process going on when we talk about the impact of racism, trauma, and oppression. He said that there's an inferiority complex if it exists. It's the outcome of a double process. He says it's primarily economic, but subsequently there's an internalization. But the warning is that we must wage war on both levels. This is from Dr. Fanon, the psychiatrist, that we wage war, and this is a model of how individuals are sort of formed in the society. This is Bronfenbrenner's model. It's called an ecological model of development. But what we have is a series of circles of influences around the individual. And they can be from the womb, from the individual's body, moving out to what we call microsystems of family structures, schools, churches, exosystems, which is neighborhoods and social welfare groups, mass media, and then further to macro systems, which are really much more cultural kinds of events. All of this occurring within time. The argument we're going to make is that when we talk about treatment, Dr. Fanon is telling us work at all levels. We're suggesting that all interventions we structure must talk and speak to each of these levels that impact the individual. So the sources of traumatic events predate the onset of people's lives, and therefore we must level our interventions at all levels, all social structures that will eventually form the individual. All right, because all of these can give rise to trauma. Must provide direct therapeutic treatment to individuals. The individual is important here, but we can't stop there. It has to be done at all levels of influence on the individual's life. All right. So again, imagine therapeutic efforts at all points on this particular circle. All right. And thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Harrell. That was very interesting. A lot of information for us to think about. It's really, I will be very interested in hearing more about the impact of trauma on and the impact of discrimination on young people and teens as they become young adults. Let us move now to Dr. Kevin Washington. Dr. Washington, would you come on, please? Dr. Washington is an Afrikaan-centered psychologist. He is an associate professor and head of psychology and sociology at Grambling State University. He is featured in many national and international medias. As a Fulbright Hays Scholar, Kevin Mwata researched the impact of socializing institutions on the healing or reconstructing of post-apartheid South Africa. There he researched Ubuntu and how it can inform mental health services and delivery to people of African ancestry. Not only does he work on healing the psycho-spiritual wounds that are presented within people as a result of cultural and historic trauma, he continues to develop healing paradigms for persons of African ancestry who have been impacted by PEST, P-E-S-T, which stands for Persistent Enslavement Systemic Trauma. He is the founder of Ubuntu Psychotherapy and Black Love Coaching. He seeks to assist people to live life with power, purpose, and passion. And I might say he has quite a bit of passion himself. Welcome, Dr. Washington. I'm looking forward to you elaborating on Ubuntu and the importance of the Black African American culture in combating the effects of racial trauma. What can be done to identify the changes that need to be made in our systemic culture? And by the way, Dr. Washington, how is your family?
Thanks for asking. We are all well. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share. It's always a privilege to be able to hear Dr. Harrell. I have admired his work for years, worked with him at Howard, but before then, admired his work in the Association of Black Psychologists. And we also want to honor the elder that made the transition, give credence to all of his endeavors to make this moment possible. Again, I know this has been a moment that we've been pulling for, making things happen for a number of months. And again, it is always an honor to be able to share the content that we hold dear and that we have indeed a great deal of passion around. So we will talk, and it's challenging to be able to have this conversation in a short span of time. So I'll do the best I can to make this make sense. But I want to ask the critical question, is that if we examine the phenomena of African enslavement that took over 400 years, what do we think has been and would have been the impact of enslavement on those that were enslaved? What do we think would have been the impact of generations of people who did the enslaving? How would they have been impacted? What are the current day effects that we can see in a particular community that suggest that there's some elements of trauma that exist? And the question that is being asked here is, what can be done about it? I want to first say that some people desire to have an anti-racist conversation, and I want to really talk more about being colorblind. And I want to say that it is imperative that we do not honor this idea of color blindness, that when I see you, I don't see color, because the question becomes, what did you see not to see what you saw? So it is critical that even in the context of trying to do the right thing, saying that when I see you, I don't see color is another act of trauma, because it disavows the essence of a person's being. I want to say then that the word trauma itself, as Dr. Harrell talked about the SAMHSA definition, which is very important, comes out of this notion of medicine, which talks about a particular organ that has been somehow penetrated or violated, and thus it has been traumatized. And so in this case, we're not talking about a physical organ of the body, we're talking about the physical essence of being, a psycho-spiritual essence of being, which is what has been impacted. And that is a psychological element of trauma. Racism is the purveyor of it, because it comes along with the white supremacist ideology that influences how things happen. And so when we talk about being anti-racist, we also are having this backwards movement process. The real issue becomes, what is it that we're honoring in a society that disavows a population from having some level of humanity? And some talk about that being white supremacy, some call it white terrorism. There are other connotations that we can engage in, but Dr. Harrell presented very eloquently the experience that George Floyd had, and that there was this honoring of a system that says one is always to be humble and have some level of humility around an oppressive force, yet that did not disavow him from being violated, as well as the medical doctor that had an encounter that again could not disavow him from having the experiences of trauma and white terrorism that influences how his body and his psychological well-being and those for generations have been impacted. I even want to pause it for a moment, Dr. Harrell. I think this is powerful to note this research that was done by Diaz and Resler with the mice, and it suggested that these mice would have a whiff of a particular fragrance, I think it was an orange blossom, and that they would be shocked, electrically shocked, as they smelt this particular a fragrance, and they began to associate this fragrance with the discomfort of the shock. And what was found in this epigenetic research was that the offspring, the pups, though they had never been shocked, when they received received the smell of the orange blossom, their bodies had a visceral response as if they had been shocked. And their offsprings would also have the similar experience, though they had never been shocked, that when they would have that smell, that their bodies would react or respond, which means that there's some element of trauma that can be passed down generationally. That is a conversation that is had among the epigeneticists. So we have to look then is that the idea of race. I want to note here that race construct, philosophical at some level, was passed around in the religious circles among various priests and monks, is driven by a worldview, and it informs human conduct, and it then drives social action. Ironman says that when we talk about trauma, we must look at it at the cultural level, and then physical trauma is one thing, but the cultural level deals with this issue of a dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric affecting the group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion. So when we talk about the idea of cultural trauma, we're saying that a group encounters this phenomena, and that is a part of the identity of a population, is this notion of the perpetual trauma that they have encountered in the space, we would say in this case, in America, this idea of being perpetually traumatized because of one's Africanity. The effects of trauma is that Cruz says that it is not necessarily the event, but is the remembrance of the event that causes this latency effect and causes some element of traumatic experiencing of the phenomena. So we talk about the issue of being traumatized. Population can be re-traumatized, that you can have several events of trauma at one time, that you can have the event of having personal trauma within your life. George Floyd can be an element of re-traumatization of your own personal dehumanization as a result of being a part of a cultural group of being disavowed. Some of the research that Dr. Harrell has done over the years really speaks to this about how one can go into a movie theater and see something that to some may be innocuous, but based on their legacy. Some of the images can evoke certain elements of high blood pressure, so on. So the issue is this idea of trauma being generational, being a part of the genetic fabric of an individual, and also it is a part of a psychological knowing of who I am. So trauma is mental, emotional, and it is physical. Trauma is interpreted oftentimes in one's meaning in life and how they struggle through various things, struggle through pains and so forth and so on. And so that is a part of the trauma. Some talk about this idea of trauma for people of African descent being post-traumatic stress, which is notion of when you encounter something, you are able to have some form of therapy after it. And so I submit that it cannot be post if it is ongoing. And so post-traumatic stress says that once an event has occurred, that is a death, near-death experience, hearing about it, encountering it, and intense loss of a feeling of helplessness and loss of self-worth and value, then one can heal from that. There is no moment that we can see where people of African descent have had a post moment. Thus, we talk about the term persistent enslavement systemic trauma. Childhood enslavement, according to Patterson, occurred in the context of a population, and let's look at what was passed on genetically, that children saw their parents degraded at the hands of the enslavers or slaveholders. The trauma of observing their parents' humiliation was later added to, again, by this sexual exploitation that took place, as well as the physical beating and lynching and castration as they grew older. So you have elements of trauma and re-traumatization in a population that is layered. And my question then, how do you think it's going to manifest generations later? The horrors of the traumatic experience, some would talk about it being the slave trade or the slave experience, but others talk about it being the ma'afa. The trauma is a psycho-spiritual disruption to one's being. The ma'afa is, according to Dr. Merva Ani, a disaster, calamity, injustice. It is important, she says, to define the events on our own terms such that we will be able to have agency. And I think that is a part of the healing process, as opposed to saying that one was enslaved or one was ancestors were slaves. You're saying that the event, the Ma'afa, I'm defining it as opposed to saying that it was a part of the slave trade. When you talk about a slave trade, you're talking about an equal swap between two parties, and that there's some kind of benefit, or a three-way trade. So there's a benefit that takes place for everybody involved. The question is, how have the Africans or others benefited from the enslavement experience, right? And so there is no real benefit there. So the question is that, how do you diagnose this? Right, or generations of trauma. What behaviors and physical health markers do you expect to see? How people will relate to themselves and relate to others is critical. What behaviors and beliefs will be passed on from generation to generation? How can one actually heal protracted group trauma? What role will denial play? That is, I deny the fact that it has happened. It is part of surviving a traumatic experience, is to deny that it has taken place, or somehow to push it out of your memory to be able to move on. Is healing possible if denial is present? And who should do the healing work? Some talk about these various terms of post-traumatic slavery disorder, post-slavery stress disorder, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and anti-alien self disorder by Dr. Naeem Magbar, who was mentioned earlier. W.B. Du Bois talks about this when he talks about double consciousness, this idea of a two-ness that takes place, that happens, and that people are trying to war to figure out, who am I? That is a psychic trauma of identity, and that's part of the work that we talk about doing. This is a generational process. That it is transgenerational. It moves on from one population to the next, and it is often untreated. Dr. Joy Grulieri calls it post-traumatic slave syndrome. That is the idea of having been injured, the trauma by larger societies and its policies and its residual effects. In South Africa, they call it continuous traumatic stress, where is this idea of a population being traumatized by the events of political violence and state violence, as well as personal violence upon themselves in their community. The events of trauma that have been highlighted already by Dr. Harrell are as follows. The idea the media projects Black inferiority, which then informs identity for population. We want to highlight, of course, educational systems project European superiority. That's why certain textbooks present certain things the way they do. And there was a big conversation recently around what should appear in textbooks in Texas and other places. And Texas and California are the largest states for textbooks suppliers. And so it's always a concern about what is the content in there. And we don't understand the Daughters of Revolution that actually inform what should appear in textbooks for children around enslavement experience. And so anytime you have this conversation where a population's legacy is being erased or sanitized, that is another form of trauma. And we also hear the same conversation occurring around the idea of the intersectionality conversation, removing certain content that may talk about race and racism, racial profiling, excessive involvement in the penal system, and so forth. These things are critical. And Dr. Harrell mentioned, of course, the Jim Crow laws. Before that, the Black Codes of 1865, and it was the same conversation over and over again of being traumatized, sundown laws, red line, gentrification. These are all elements of trauma that a population experienced outside of this traumatic physical incursion of individuals coming together, again, a cultural phenomenon of a population coming together to violate another person. So there's always this idea of a population that is coming out to get someone. And it does not matter what you look like. The issue is there's this cultural phenomenon that happens. That's why some call it white terrorism. I suggest that it is persistent enslavement, systemic trauma, psychological devastation, spiritual disruption, emotional destabilization, economic disinheritance, and political disenfranchisement. That is something of traumatic experiences that one has to look at. For example, people of African descent often have to be concerned with what schools they attend, think about what they name their children so that their children can navigate it in an environment such so that they are not somehow isolated or attacked or aggressed against. Those are elements of trauma. I had a student to say, yes, you're right, Dr. Washington. My parents named me Brittany because they did not want anybody to know that I was white, I was Black. And I said, Brittany, one day that they would have to see you. But think about what was it like for that parent to know that they were having a child, going to have to navigate a race-conscious society and want to give their child a name so that the child would not have the incursion of trauma. So this has a great toll on the Black psyche, and we have to look at racism, oppression, dehumanization, and how do we begin to address these issues? We already know some of the data talks about the African Americans, Blacks are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress, and adult Blacks living below poverty are likely to have elements of duress. We also understand that adult Blacks have feelings of sadness and hopelessness and worthlessness greater than others. And also what we're noticing is, of course, in this era, we're noticing that there's an increase in suicide attempts, as well as suicides, successful suicides among African Americans, especially African American females. Again, we say that there's some residual effect of the trauma. Trauma, again, Du Bois talks about men being stripped of their pride and self-respect and humiliated. These things have gone on to create a condition that we can look at the biopsychosocial level of living in a perpetual state of fight or flight. And we understand that over a period of time, this can cause some very significant challenges within the body, increased cortisol level, this is sugar craving, high allostatic load, and so forth and so on, high blood pressure. So what we can submit here to is this understanding that much of the health issues that we find within the population of African descent in this country can be linked to the effects of trauma, of racism, and other forms of terror, of trauma. That is, seeking to find a way to survive in a space that is not necessarily forgiven for their existence. So we understand the psychological aspect of this, but are we understanding the influence of such on hypertension, high blood pressure, the high occurrence of kidney failure, the high occurrence of aggressive nature of breast cancer, of ovarian cancer, prostate cancer. So all these things are associated with it, obesity and so forth and so on, can be associated with this notion of trauma and trying to survive in a space. For example, we understand the allostatic load and trauma and how people try to exist, and the cortisol that is increased in the process, and high blood pressure and poor glucose regulations and sugar cravings, which can contribute to health issues. And so now we talk about this conversation around COVID-19 and a population being vulnerable, in part vulnerable not only because of their ethnicity, but because of their situation of living under constant duress, that when something comes in, such as a virus, the body is already vulnerable to it because of existing in a space where they're at a constant state of fight and or flight. So I just wanted to move through this. I kind of want to touch on those things. I want to hear what Tara said about trauma. And she said that there's type 1 and type 2, and type 2 is when a person experiences recurring trauma. What is it like? And we want to suggest that when we talk about the recurring trauma, we can see that it can cause some significant challenges within the body and within a society. So it changes how I think about myself. It changes how I interact with others. It influences how I engage with people like myself and people unlike myself. You have to be critical in understanding that this process of dealing with trauma can create some conditions of physical and psychological duress that all have to be addressed. And so we talk about addressing this in the context of understanding an African-centered normative structure. That is, how does a group that's been violated see themselves? What is their worldview? The idea of spirit and family and group and interdependence. And what is the influence of enslavement? The idea of lack of identity, of being oppressed, and the European notion of materialism, and how does that influence things? Well, we talk about that, and then we talk about this idea of African transgenerational trauma counseling. How do we counsel through those things? And then we have this idea of enlightenment or alignment and Ubuntu. I want to suggest then that an African paradigm values the collective, looks at the communal spirit as primary, and the healing of the spirit is essential. What's important to capture here is that when we do this work around trauma, what we're doing is that we're looking at ways to identify levels of impact at the interpersonal, social, cultural, institutional, and geopolitical levels. And this is what Dr. Harrell mentioned when he mentioned Bronfenbrenner's conversation of the meso-macro level of this. And he said, Frantz Fanon says that you must influence all of those spheres. We must look at ways of resetting the nervous system. How do you manage arousal? How do you manage emotions? How do you, the idea of someone would call it emotional intelligence, right? How do you free the body of the impact of generational trauma and also the immediate traumas that you encounter? What is the idea of mastering staying present? Too often, people who have been traumatized find escape routes. And so there's a desire not to stay present. So our work talks about how do you talk about staying present? How do you monitor trauma symptoms? And how do you feel the full range of emotions? A population or person typically that has been violated oftentimes have flat affect, that the idea of not of feeling a full range of emotions because of the trauma that's been encountered, they become somehow deadened to a space that has been found among individuals that have been rape victims, as well as what happens to a cultural group that has happened for generations and generations. 400 years of the same thing. Coming to peace with memories is very important. If we know that the memory of the phenomena is it, how do we come to peace with that memory? And we can see several narratives of individuals who were haunted by the memory of what they could and could not do based on the experiences of trauma, racialized trauma. How do you fill in what is missing? That is, that there's a void that takes place. And so we teach people how to talk about filling what's missing and how do you talk about becoming whole. And what we find is that altruism is one of the key ways of healing. And we see that it has happened within the Black community over generations. And in closing, this idea that we see that the Black community has formed units, such as a church family. And how do you give back to your church family? So it's always this idea of altruism and giving back to others that's been a way for healing. How do we talk about giving back to others at the same time as being aware of why we're giving back to others? And so we talk about the cultural healing. I do African drumming. We talk about dance, spoken word. How do you talk it out, drum it out, move it out? And more importantly, how do you just simply live beyond it? And you mentioned Ubuntu, and I'm so honored to have gone to South Africa and looked and studied Ubuntu, the philosophy, and I see it as one of the key factors in the healing work. UBU meaning being, into you meaning unifying life force. And so we talk about Ubuntu. The late Desmond Tutu says that we're talking about this idea of being whole. It speaks to compassion. A person with Ubuntu is welcoming, hospitable towards others, is generous. The quality of Ubuntu gives people resilience, enabling them to survive and emerge still human, despite all efforts to dehumanize them. This is the crux of the work we talk about with Ubuntu. In closing, the proverb from the Xhosa and the Zulu, they say Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabanya, Abantu, which says an individual's humanity, identity is expressed in relationships with others. And the Zulu says Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabantu, which says a person is a person because they're other people. The story goes that this person was coming in to give to children some treats in this African community, and they didn't have enough treats for everyone. And so what happened is that they wanted to see how they were going to resolve the problem, and he found that the children simply stopped and gathered everyone around and found a way to share this treat with everyone. And the question by the scientists European scientists was why do they do this? He said, because if I have something, we all have to have something. That's a profound element of humanity. What I will say then, when we talk about doing this healing work beyond trauma, it is this notion of the groupness, the idea of the meso and the macro level of healing that takes place, that says that we are all better when I'm better, and when I'm better, we're all better. Thank you all for allowing us to have this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Washington.
I have 100 more slides to go, but I just simply want to pause there.
Could you talk a little bit about resilience?
Okay. So, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. That was a part of where we were going to go with this conversation, but the notion of how resilience is even elevated within a population occurs within the context of having the recurring themes or elements of trauma. So when we then look at the dynamics of encountering the isms of life, the sexism, racism, ageism, egoism, it begins to facilitate one understanding who they are and this idea of personhood. John Bitcher says that I am because we all are, therefore I am. And when we talk about this, we're saying then that a person is recognizing that because they belong to something greater than themselves, it facilitates them to be able to move forward. I will say it this way, that we noticed in this song by Gladys Knight, when she says that I have to use the best of my imagination to keep on keeping on in a bad situation. The idea of I have to go into my essence to be able to understand how to move forward. We see that this has been something that has been a part of the African reality that has allowed the group to actually sustain itself. Another example would be this, is that when something would happen and someone would ask the question, how your mom and them, right? That is a ebonically correct way of saying how is your mother and the rest of them. And so there's always the issue of how is your mother and the rest of them, how your mom and them, that says that how are things in your space, in her space. And then you say, well, she's fine, but Ray is out there on that stuff again. Well, tell your mom I'm going to come by. I'm gonna pray for her. And then when a person comes by that brings greens, you say, what is the idea of bringing greens by got to do with Ray out on strung out on drugs somewhere? But the issue is that Ray belongs to the community, but the person, as they're preparing these greens or whatever they're preparing, they're praying over those things. That is an incantation. That is saying that based on this idea of altruism, I know that my life is out of order. Her life is out of order right now. I'm going to give the essence that I have, my SOLU, that makes this now soul food. That's the idea of resilience as well. I'm going to give of myself to the person. And as a result, I'm going to be able to facilitate the healing. And before the person would leave the house, there's going to be a circle, a prayer again to say that we are together. How does it then impact resilience? It says that you're not in this alone, right? You're not here alone. I think that is one of the major challenges that we're finding among our youth today, is because they're stuck here on the devices. And I watch them all day in class, and they're more isolated than the idea of understanding how we work together. So resilience then comes about in the context of knowing that you are not alone. We talk about the cleansing process and spiritual cleansing. And so our work really is about how do you restore breath? You know that Michael Brown says, George Floyd said, I can't breathe. Many people can't breathe on a regular basis. We talk about the power of breath. Inspiration is coming into being. Expiration is transitioning. When spiritual energy is altered, breath changes. And so we talk about the issue of restoration of breath. You have breath, you have voice. That's resilience. The idea of not speak black, to me, that's my stuff. Black Lives Matter. That is an idea of using your breath, your voice to impact, influence change. And so that is where resilience actually gains it.
Thank you. All of a sudden you have frozen on us for a moment. So much that you and Dr. Harrell have shared with us today. I'm reminded of a quote that James Carbano wrote when he said, the initial trauma of a young child may go underground, but it will return to haunt us. And if we don't understand that each of us is a person because of others, we can't move on with this, but we also need to understand that in order to rectify what has happened before us. As we go into this, I also learned a new word from you, Mahafa. Every time I meet you, I learn something new. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
At this point, I'd like Nancy Briggs and John Gaskin, Alonzo Gaskin, to please come on the screen. And will Dr. Washington and Dr. Harrell come on the screen and unmute yourselves. And they're going to, Nancy and John are going to ask you some follow-up questions. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. My first question is, how do white people unknowingly contribute to this persistent trauma for people of color? And what can we as white people do to improve daily experiences of trauma for people of color? Either one of you.
My first statement on that before we let a real clinician talk about it, because Dr. Washington can speak to these things. But one is there's sort of a status quo mentality that we've really got to fight against, and we're in a life and death struggle on that right now. That to assume that in fact everything is all right because we're not seeing this, that, and the other is a very bad assumption. That notion of that we're just talking about, this idea of things going underground, that can happen, but they still fester underground, you know. So I think that the first thing we have to deal with is this whole idea that status quo mentality has to be dismissed out of hand, and we have to be willing to you know, to wrestle with the legacy of 400 years more and more of this type of thing. Dr. Washington.
Yeah, that is on point. I think the idea of acceptance as a panacea for eradication of enslavement or the trauma therein is a very dangerous thing, that we tolerate one another. Tolerance does not resolve the issue. The issue is what is the issue, and the issue has been levels of trauma meted out against a population that is grounded in ideology. So the work occurs among populations to be able to challenge the ideology that is perpetuated through literature, through textbooks, through the media. These things are critical. My daughter, my youngest daughter, when she was about 7, 8 years old, asked me the question, Daddy, how would white girls feel if the only dolls they saw on television were Black? Right? That's a critical question that she was asking, and a question then speaks to how she was recognizing the subtle effects of white supremacist ideology. So we have to recognize that these things occur, and not to assume that because whites jump in and say, hey, I'm going to come in and save you. Sometimes it's not about saving others. It's about stopping and saying, what are we doing as a group? And how can us as a group then modify what we do that influences everybody else around us, right? And James Brown said it best. He said that I don't need you to open the door, just get out the way and let me open myself. Sometimes it's by getting out the way so that we can do the work among ourselves. And I think sometimes people jump in and block that healing work. So I'll stop there. Pause there.
Thank you. Alonso?
Yes. Gentlemen, you just touched on your daughter and the white doll. What is it that we can do, or is there a listing of things that we can develop to help mitigate the effects of trauma on our children?
Dr. Harrell, I'm out the way, Dr. Harrell, that's you.
Well, okay, well, you know, you're speaking to fathers here now, and we've seen this thing. I know that's probably the most serious question that I always tell my students, that they'll wrestle with nothing, you know, more stringently than they'll wrestle with the proper education and you know, the socialization of their children. That's just something that really bothers you. I think the first thing to recognize is the prevailing winds are against their growth and development. I'm talking about the prevailing winds, the things that are just sort of out there automatically in society. You know, who is, you know, you just think in terms of media images and the flood of media, even with all the correction factors people are trying to get, they're out there. So if you recognize that those are the prevailing winds, then you'll realize the intervention has to occur prenatally. It has to occur before they're born, you know, and you start affirming processes even when the child is, you know, is in utero. You know, song, music, everything that's in that field has to be sort of affirming for that child, because when they bump up against the real, you know, the school systems, when they bump up against what's out there in terms of this crazy popular cultural media stuff that's out there that tell us, you know, horrible things about our own bodies and about our own spirits. When they bump up against that, they've got to have some buffers already in place. You can't have them, well, I'll send you off to an HBCU when you're 18. Too late. The buffers have to be there from early on. Dr. Washington, why don't you go ahead?
I'm always listening. I'm always learning. The it's you are right. What can be done? The last part I think is so important of what Dr. Harrell said. All of it was important. The last part just really hits me when this same daughter that talks about this doll texted me when I was one day at Howard teaching Dr. Harrell in class, and she said, "This is what she just learned in class, that Africans did nothing to contribute to the world history." Then she texted me again about a month or two later. The pyramids were built by aliens, and each time she texted me, she had LOL. And then and this is when she was in middle school. I never forget, she was in 6th grade, and the last one was Hitler did not go into Africa to take anything. There was nothing of value to take out of Africa, and she had an LOL. And what was amazing is that she was able to text LOL, like she could laugh at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to what you were saying earlier about the inoculation, right? If we don't have the content on the front side to have the inoculation, it has to happen very early on. Otherwise, the onslaught that is out there that will take over their minds. And so it's important that children, that adults all take time to be able to understand that everybody has contributed to the forward flow of humanity, not just one population. It is imperative to understand that if we talk about, again, Black History or Black History Month or whatever it's called, to be able to recognize that not only whites in the world created things that were great and wonderful. That shifts the whole psyche of a population when you talk about the notion of the cell phone to the clock and other things invented by African Americans and other people like that. That changes how children see themselves. They can live beyond the identity of being inferior, less than. And so that is critical, but also it forces whites to do the same. For example, when there was going to be a celebration of Dr. King's holiday, there were several states in the Union, Virginia, Texas, others, changed the date, the celebration to not being Dr. King holiday, but they changed it to either the Confederacy Day or Robert E. Lee Day. And this, if you look at it right now, you will see that is a transmission of cultural identity, but also it's a disavowing of others. And then people say, well, what's the big deal? My last story, my son just a few years ago graduated in Virginia from high school, and he was instrumental in his sophomore and junior year of putting together the Black History Month program. White male says that he's so glad now that he's graduating, he no longer has to endure those boring something Black History Month programs, right? So even though we talk about doing the right thing, right, by presenting content to a population, if the population is not receptive to it and see it as something that is valuable, we only have the repeating of the same thing generationally, that is white supremacy and terrorism all over again, which is why we have to go back to saying inoculation of our children, and we keep doing the same thing generation after generation.
Nancy?
Yeah, okay. A lot of stuff here, a lot of material. I think this may be a question more for Dr. Harrell, but both of you jump in if you need to. How do generational trauma and the vicarious trauma of knowing about an event, a traumatic event against somebody who is not in your immediate circle or area, operate and impact today's environment?
This might be a reference to a really interesting study that came out about 3 years ago in Lancet, the British Medical Journal. And that study is one that we use in methodology classes because they sampled well over 100,000 African Americans. But the difference was they were looking at populations where, in fact, or samples where, in fact, there had been a killing of an unarmed Black person by the police, and those where it had not occurred. And people periods, and they can sort of control for a lot of other variables in this massive study. And of course, what they found is that, in fact, there's a mental health effect of simply living where there was, in fact, the killing of an unarmed, African American. in these cities, and it shows up in the days that they were actually taking off of work for mental health days in this thing. And so what we're suggesting, this vicarious notion that it doesn't necessarily, and even with the spread of information across the world, but when it happens in your community, when it happens around you, and you are sort of processing it, you may not even discuss it at work, or you may not discuss it at home, but you're still processing it. And so I think what we've got to look at in something like that is that these things enter the same way that TV ads enter us. You know, before you know it, we want a Coke. You know, before you know it, we want these things come at us. You know, and they really do impact us. Oftentimes out of awareness. I think that's something and so you say, okay, if that's the case, then will you try to bring these things to awareness? You say, oh, there it is again. Here it is again. And you sort of try to make those things that are being processed unconsciously much more conscious, and then wrestle with them. You know, and this is, again, Dr. Washington's extremely important point. This is a collective process. You don't do this yourself. You do this in a collective group, so that in fact you can sort of hear and see the perceptions of others, and that's part of the healing, I think.
Mhm. That would seem to be the basis of crisis intervention therapy.
Yes.
For instance, I'm an emergency physician for pre-hospital people and emergency physicians who have been involved in it. That's the idea, is that you attack it, you try to process it as a group, not individually.
I think so. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Washington, you have anything to add to that?
And I don't, because I'll actually extend the conversation beyond our time. But I wanted to just say Dr. Harrell is actually spot on. And I noticed someone put in the chat that how many people knew even the potato chip was invented by a Black man. I wanted to. This speaks to the point about the trauma and the community, that and never discussing this. We talk about inventing the potato chip, but what happened is that the potato was cut in a certain way, and a white patron complained to a Black man about the potato chip being too thick. And so out of spite, he went back and said he cut it thin to say, now do you like this, right? So so the potato chip, though it's something that was created by a Black man, it came out of the trauma of being dehumanized in Saratoga, New York. So it's important to catch these various elements that have been around for generations. So the research study speaks to the idea of the potato chip, and the course coming out of that is, what community in New York, in the United States, benefit financially from the potato chip that's been invented by a Black man, which then means I'm back again upset and angry.
Yes.
Yeah, Black men invented it, and then yet we still are economically deprived, right? Which then goes into the discussion that was, again, crisis. That's why I mentioned earlier about re-traumatization. These are elements of re-traumatization over and over and over again.
Alonzo, you're next. We have a little bit of time left.
Okay. Gentlemen, as a community, we seem to be reticent to make the move to say our lives are of value. We always want to take the back seat. And it seems to me that trauma continues to increase as long as we take that back seat. Is there something we can do to move our community forward, to let them really see their value?
One of the things, Dr. Hill, because I think that your words in closing going to be the hit here. I'm just going to throw this out here. That one of the things is that we somehow believe that there's some virtue as a people of African descent in going along to get along, to being complacent, but also that is a result of the trauma that one has incurred, that you do not, to not speak out, to not share, to not do things. All you have to do is just simply go along to get along. And if you do that, don't make the people mad. Just go to work, get your lesson at school, right? And just move forward. Because we think somehow if you do that, everything's going to be okay. And I think that's a survival mechanism that has a deleterious effect on our well-being on multiple levels, not only physically, not discussing it, but as you mentioned, politically, socially, economically, because our voices really never get heard. And so it is in the expression of the pain, of the process, or even of the power that comes about as a result of this, that we can begin to see better markers. And I'll say this, research done by Watkins talks about Black men and having self-mastery, and saying that when Black men are able to show some level of self-mastery, that is making changes in the community, actively engaging in certain activities that make a difference, they have better health outcomes. So it is imperative that we talk about people demonstrating agency in the area of gifting or the area of talents or the area of strengths. So if you are a teacher, how then do you talk about teaching in a way that empowers a population that has been disenfranchised, but also it levels out the playing field? If you're doing research like Dr. Harrell is doing, how do you make sure that the research is relevant to a population that needs the healing work? If you talk about being a theologian, how do you deliver a message that is empowering? People like Reverend Jeremiah Wright did such, and it became something that President Barack Obama had to disassociate with in order to move forward. That's a heavy piece, because that is a messaging that occurs within the Black church, is be aware of what is happening around you. So the point is, how do you empower people to actually deliver a message of support, of love for those around their area of talent and gifting? That's the first step that I would say is take. Dr. Harrell, you
Yeah, again, really, there's another session we would have to discuss that question that you just raised. I think it starts off with the answer starts off with a certain confidence that from time immemorial, there's always been a tradition among the oppressed and among Black people and African people, wherever they were, there was a tradition of authentic resistance and authentic growth. And that exists now. If you look at the hip hop underground now and what's going on there, and sometimes and in the theater movements, with what's going on in theater around, and not only in the United States, but around the world, it's going to be there. The issue becomes, will we support it? Because these people they'll be producing it. We need to take our children and expose them to these individuals who are off the beaten track when it comes. But in every community, you're going to find them. You're going to find them. And I think that what we've got to do is recognize that sometimes it may not be as glossy as what's being produced by Hollywood or by some other, it may not be, but as art, it's more important, and it causes us to humanize ourselves and grow better. But these people are definitely out there. These people are struggling, these artists, and they've been there. It's just that they try to sort of cover them up or peripheralize them and talk about these individuals. Well, don't listen to that person. They're not doing anything you want to hear. You want to listen to this foolishness over here. That as we push our children and show our children the beauty and the power in this, I think the arts are going to be the center of this thing. I'm sorry that I do believe that our artists and our creative people are going to be very much part of the solutions. And I think a lot of the behavioral scientists and medical scientists will ride along in their crest, But there's something about what they're doing there that we've got to really support if we want to now break this thing open.
All right.
Gentlemen, we thank you so very much for your time, but our time is up. And Hugh?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you both. This was just amazing.
And
Thank you.
Hold on, we still have some more questions for the two of you from the audience, from the chat. And they've been really interesting and really wonderful. And I wish I could include all of them. One of the last ones, and I can read this off here. I'm a senior citizen. We had hoped that racism would be a thing of the past as we marched in the 60s. I've given my children and grands complete knowledge of African-American contribution. How do we get white people to give up their supremacy? Woo. Maybe I should be answering that.
No, but I was suffering. I'm going to tell you, when if you would have told me when I was an undergraduate student that we would be wrestling with some of the very basic kinds of questions that we're wrestling with now, you know, in terms of historical knowledge, knowledge about human beings, you know, some 60 years later. I would allow, I said, no, we'll have that, we'll clean that up. We've got to recognize that these things are structural. They're built into every structure within the society. It's within the education system. People make money off of it. So it's in the, and Dr. Francis Cress Welsing talked about all levels of the activities that people engage in. It's there. And I think that it was sort of like a kind of naivety we had that, okay, we can fix this and tinker with this over here and everything will be all right. This stuff is very deep seated. And I think that it's just a matter of people going ahead and saying, okay, this is the, you know, we're in for the long haul and we'll go down fighting. And at that point, you know, you're not looking for the quick fix or and by quick fix, I'm talking about a couple of generations. No, this is going to take some time. This is going to take some time.
And added to that, what happens when that idea of white supremacy becomes a part of your identity? And so when you ask someone to give up their identity, right, the thing that they have to hold on to so dearly, you are asking them to actually change and reorder their entire perception of themselves and how they have set up their dreams and visions and aspirations around such, right? And so it is important to note that white supremacist ideology is a thing that we have been challenged to deal with, not simply the idea of going to the food counter to eat, not going through the front door. Those things are simply structural phenomena, but the deep-seated issue is the ideology. And that ideology guides and governs everything. And that's what Dr. Ani talks about. We talked about the utamawazo of a culture, the germ seed of a culture. And when you identify that thing, right, that idea that this is who we are, and we will die on the hill to protect that. So much so that on January 6th, we will go to the Capitol and we will tear it down because of the identity, the idea of we are superior, right? And so woven into that is this notion of we are perpetually inferior. So we have a population that believes itself to be second class. So why would I go to a Black school? Because it's not as good as a white school. Why would I go why would I do those things? So there's internalized oppression that comes about as a result of that. So we have to deal with multiple levels of reality. And that is, how do we begin to challenge the identity that we've all established around this false notion that there's one group superior to another. And that will, as Dr. Harrell said, that means that we're in for the long haul. That will take some time to unpack, but we start from one cell at a time. This conversation, the big conversation, is one cell at a time. It's not going to happen mass all of a sudden, because it didn't happen all of a sudden like that. We didn't get enslavement all of the time. It happened little by little. We deal with Zuraga and others who talked about this issue of the inferior African and how that took place. We find that it was small steps. It would take small steps to come out of this. And so the work that you all are doing, and that we're all doing, are small steps. It just takes time to get there.
One of the initiatives that's going on across the country in different places and in different ways is the move to reparations. What's your take on reparations?
I think there's several levels to that, but one is it's extremely important for people to recognize I think there's a book called Repair that's really quite interesting, where they talk about the transfer of wealth. It's just about, well, it's taking place right now from the boomers to the next generation. And we're talking about probably trillions and trillions of dollars will be passed on. And very little of that is going to happen within the Black community. All right, this is all built up wealth over time that talks about this thing. And so what we want to recognize, if we had, the form is another question, but the damage, there's no question about that. There's no question about the injury and damage. And I think that's the beauty of and the pain of the article, of the book I was quoting from George Floyd. I read that thing, and the way that things were sort of, the way that things led to a knee being on his neck in Minneapolis. A lot of that went way, way back hundreds of years.
Right.
And so we've got to recognize the people, and especially with, I tell young African-American kids, don't think this was just a case of somebody didn't get a paycheck. It was much more than that. And it wasn't just a case of, well, okay, that a man came along and said, you're all free now. It's much more than that. So if we recognize the extent of damage, then the issue becomes, okay, what form will this take? What form will this take? And that's where the conversations will become very rich. But to try to minimize it and say, okay, well, everybody was rough on everybody. No, that's a minimization that's really that's obscene at this time.
It is, and reparations means to repair. And what Dr. Harrell mentions is very clear that there's a repairing that has to take place. And it's not simply monetizing that repair. And that's where Western society gets down to everything most things are monetized, right? What is the dollar amount that we could put on this that makes us all go away? There's some pains that no dollar amount can settle for. And we have to recognize that the repair occurs on multiple levels. Not only does repair occur economically, the repair occurs psychologically, educationally, and otherwise, health-wise. That is a repair. For me, it has to be a global reparations phenomena. We cannot continue to bifurcate African people and say that you in America are going to get this, when in reality, there was a siphoning off of Africans from a continent and utilize their genius to satisfy wealth in this space. For example, we know that the technology to grow cotton and make it into a fabric was in the Senegambia region first, and Europeans were going there to get the fabrics and shipping and trading it from there, and decided to bring the population to the US to cut out the travel expense of getting the cloth around. That became an economic development piece, and therefore cotton became king and was the first major source of economic development in the world for this country called United States of America. That's critical. We know that there's a rice called Carolina Gold that, again, they brought Africans from the Senegambia region who understood how to siphon out the salt water and make it what they call sweet water in the Gambia, make it fresh water to grow the rice. And it took time for that to happen. Snakes and people were killed in the enterprise, but the Carolina Gold saved this country after the Civil War. This is not only an issue of economics, but it's understanding the generational wealth that has been created from siphoning off the generational wealth from another population. That's why it has to be, for me, a global issue of repair, that if these countries on the continent are in debt to Europe, then how do we begin to say that these are people that have been violated, and now what was not paid to these people in the United States arrest the debt over there, and now we have economic development where we're gaining resources again, and now everybody's benefiting from the cocoa. I got to share this, Dr. Harrell, that because we went to Ghana, and the chocolate was so good in Ghana. But anyway, the idea is that that Hershey's chocolate makes in 1/4 on the cocoa bean more than the country of Ghana makes in an entire year on the cocoa bean, and the cocoa bean comes out of primarily out of Ghana, right? That has to be addressed. That's reparations. So it's not simply how do we repair in the United States, but how do we repair economically? How do we repair the engineering, the genius that's benefited if Gladys West invented the I've forgotten the lady's name now, that invented I'm saying GPS is one thing, but I'm thinking about Broom, who invented the home security system. Where is there Black wealth around these things, right? That have impact. If Kenneth Dunkley invented the 3D technology, and yet 3D movies are phenomenal right now, where is that wealth? The repair occurs on multiple levels: psychologically, emotionally, economically. And again, Dr. Wilson talks about these 9 areas of people activity, and they just profound. If you read a book, ISIS papers, you'll see it from Neely Fuller's work. It's amazing work, and those areas have to be addressed. So thank you.
Thank you both. We have lots of questions that went unanswered, but that's a testimony to the two of you. You're a dynamic pair. And I thank you, and I see my wife is to my right, so I best turn things back over to her. And thank you again.
Thank you. And we will, for those of you who have put other questions in the chat, we will find a way to have these answered. But part of that is going to come in your small groups that we're about to go to. And our panelists, both of them have agreed to join some of the small groups. So you will be able to ask your questions there. But remember, we need to bring this down now to our local area. And how can we address this at the local area? Again, panelists, thank you so much. We are so indebted to you for such an informative hour. For the rest of us, I'm wondering how many of us were listening and thought to ourselves, I didn't know that. Or that reminds me of something that happened in my own family. I know what happened to me. Now, let me lead you through the next part of our program. Before we go to the breakout rooms, we have been honored by 3 courageous local people who have agreed to share their racial trauma stories with us in a video, very brief video vignette called Lived Experiences. We're going to show that after I give you some information about the breakout room sessions. Robin will send us to the breakout rooms. We don't need to do anything except we will get a pop-up message that asks if you want to enter the breakout room and just answer that message. After a brief pause, you should find yourself in the breakout room with your facilitators. Once you're in there, you can turn on your video and unmute yourself. But please remember, in the small group with your trained facilitators are designed to create an atmosphere of trust for the group, for your small group. We ask you to listen carefully, listen deeply, speak only from your own experience, and raise your hand either physically or virtually when you wish to speak. 10 minutes before the session is over, you will be receiving a heads up warning that we're going to take you back to the main group in 10 minutes. When you are returning to the main meeting, we ask you to turn your video and mute off and mute yourself. Should the need arise and you find that you have encountered a personal problem, we have a counselor staffed quiet room. To get there, all you need to do is, depending on how your Zoom, what version of Zoom you have, is we can either click on the bottom right-hand side where it says leave, and that will take you back to the main room. Or if you don't have that button and it simply see the 3 dots down there or up at the top, click on that and it will say leave to main meeting room. Click on that. Do not leave the entire session. So once you go, you will enter into the main room, and then Robin and I will connect you with one of our counselors, and you will be in a quiet place without any other interference. After the breakout session, you will go immediately back into the main room for our closing with Sherry Tardio, Director of the Mediation Center of Calvert County, and your facilitators will be reporting out on what you felt was the most important point or topic or question that you had. So with that, Robin, will you please roll the videos? And we'll see you in an hour.
Hello, I'm Pastor Joan Jones. pastor of St. Edmund's United Methodist Church, and I'm also a native of Calvert County.
Pastor Jones, please share with us an experience that you've had that made it difficult for you to trust white people.
The most challenging experience that I had was during my high school years. It was the onset of school integration, and so many people weren't quite sure how it would unfold. So my experience occurred on the bus. As we boarded the bus in the morning, there were other students who had strategically placed themselves one in a seat. So when we got on, there weren't many seats left. And so we were not always invited to sit. So sometimes we had to push up or even step over persons just to get a seat. Or during this time, the bus driver was yelling at us to sit down so that he could move on. Needless to say, it did not make for a pleasant morning most mornings.
Pastor Jones, what would you like the forum participants today to know about racial trauma?
Racial trauma is something that once you experience it, it is very difficult and challenging to ever forget it. I remember as I went through various experiences, I had this feeling that I did not trust white folk, or I maybe was on the borderline of not liking them. But then I realized that there were some things that they didn't understand about me and I didn't understand about them. So a part of racial trauma is working through all of the hurt and coming to the point of there is forgiveness and there is healing when you begin to understand each other better. So racial trauma at the beginning was a negative, but you can turn it into a positive feeling.
Hello, my name is Skip Steiner. I'm an Episcopal priest at Middleham and St. Peter's Parish. Pastor Skip, could you share with us your thoughts about white privilege? Yes, I grew up in a segregated community, attended segregated public schools, including college. And it has taken me probably 68 years or more to come to understand that I had white privilege and how it benefited me. It is my hope that I will be able to keep learning about white privilege and be an example to others to understand the meaning of white privilege in their lives.
My name is Irvin Beverly. I'm a lifelong resident of Lusby, Maryland.
Pastor Beverly, please tell us what you would like the forum participants to know about racial trauma.
When I was 16, April 1953, my brother was driving, hit with a drunk driver. My brother was killed, my sister and two cousins. One was 2 and one was 1 year old. The ambulance came, picked up the man who had hit us, took him to the hospital in the ambulance because he couldn't take black people in the ambulance. When I was 16, I was in an accident on Easter Sunday of 1953. A drunk driver hit my brother. My brother died. My sister, 2 cousins died in the accident. The driver sued my deceased brother, and he won the case. And on our way home from court, my mother asked me to make her a promise that I would not hate the people who had just did this to us. And I promised Mama that I would not hate them, because she said hate was too heavy a burden for me to carry the rest of my life from 16 years old.
So welcome back, everybody, from your breakout groups. My name is Sherry Tardio. I'm the director of the Community Mediation Center of Calvert, and I'll be facilitating this next section of our program. So as you heard Robin say, one facilitator for each group should have their video on. Everybody else can turn their video off, and if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. What I'm going to do, we have 13 breakout groups. So I'll be calling each breakout group in order to report back on that last question that your groups all talked about, which is basically what is one idea, question that you want to bring back to the main group that you would like to share. So one tidbit that you would like to talk about. Please be mindful that, again, we have 13 groups. So if you could just be brief with that, and then there will be people taking notes on it. And so I will start with group number 1, which was Joan and Antoine. So whoever, I see Antoine. Antoine, did you want to report out for your group?
There we go. Good evening, everyone. I had a very lively group, so we tried to encapsulate what they were talking about. One of the main things that came out from our group was recruiting others, reaching out to other groups to find out what's going on so we can share communication. This is with age, gender, the communication is not there. So it's very hard to fix a problem if you don't know that there is a problem. Some people still aren't understanding that white supremacy and racism really does exist. And also how racial trauma is passed down through generations, and not only through with education and with wealth and with different traumas that are taken on by youth without even knowing it. They also spoke of the churches, how Sunday is one of the most divided days of the week, and if the churches could possibly come together and start communicating. And one example was to do like a pastor swap, where a pastor from DC is swapping with a pastor down here, just to really get ingrained into that community to see what how we can fix some of the problems that we have. And we were also talking about the fears and the things that we have, of the fears of the unknown, and also with people arming themselves with weapons, even in suburban areas, or to protect themselves because of the way the United States is right now. It's just in a really bad state, and people are in fear. So communication was one of the biggest things that came out from our group.
Thank you, Antoine. So for your group, communicating more, because people don't know what they don't know. So there needs to be more communication among groups of different ages, races, genders, everything. Thank you. Group number 2 is Sharon and John. So whoever's reporting out.
Sorry, I always do that. Okay, I think I'm on now. So anyway, the overarching theme of in response that the group's response was to that last question was education in the broadest sense of the word, meaning, first of all, and I think probably the highest, was teaching history authentically, okay? And specifically getting, recruiting teachers, people from groups of color, African Americans, what have you, so that their faces are present in Southern Maryland in those teaching roles, and who can act as role models. Also, teaching about systemic racism. We had a early childhood education, early childhood educator in our group, and she talked about spending as much time, more time teaching about Black history as they do about Santa Claus in the lead up to Christmas, which I thought was very interesting. And then more specifically, how these concepts are taught so that so as not to re-traumatize children of color, and but in such a way as to educate children that are, children that are not children of, people of color. And then finally, a point that was made at the end was about educating citizens about the voting process and who the candidates are for roles like in the school boards and the commissioners. And we heard during our conversation about situations where the health officer was almost fired or gotten rid of, and who was showing up on the school board that might have gotten in the way of the appointment of a new school superintendent. So that's even education on another level or in another dimension, and that is educating citizens in that part of the state about who is running for these local offices and the importance on this overall conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So all aspects of education.
Yes.
Okay, group number 3 is Tia and Andrew. Andrew, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, hi, everybody. So we had a really rich conversation about a lot of things. And the two concepts, one is the idea and the other is kind of the questions that we're putting them into one, is the idea of acknowledging the trauma, the generational trauma that is there and continues to exist, where systems and even individuals are not acknowledging or saying that they're responsible or naming it, if you will, and wanting us to get to a place where we stop othering, considering people as others. And it's, it came up in so many situations around police, dialogues with police, media, the education system, how municipalities spend their money in terms of wanting to correct certain social problems, like all of these things, part of the acknowledgement, and really left with the question of how do we get to this place of not othering people. Ubuntu, that was one that stuck with some folks, and even coming out of First Nations, this idea that we're all one and stop looking at people as if we're all different. And so that's the thing that rose to the top, and the question about what do we do?
Thank you so much, group number 3. Group number 4 is Elaine and Shirley. I see Shirley on the screen, so you can unmute yourself.
Oh, so I apologize, everyone, but good afternoon. And our lively dynamic group had several thoughts and discussions surrounding trauma, healing, and acknowledgement of the traumas. And what became apparent is the obligation to turn on our receptors and to listen and understand the traumas of Blacks, Indigenous, Hispanics, and Jewish and Latinas in that community, so that we all help to heal each other by providing opportunities to hear of our other experiences and to make informed changes through the responsibility and not guilt.
Thank you so much. Responsibility and not guilt. Thank you. Okay, group number 5, Louise and Nicole. Louise, you can unmute.
Thank you all. Gosh, wonderful group number 5. Dismantling racism and institutional racism and working towards trauma healing is a slow, lifelong process. That's the big takeaway, that we will slide up and down. It's not linear. There will be progress and then there will be regression, and our work will not be over in our lifetimes. So we need to build resilience. And we have a number of 12 quick ways to do that. know that racism is deep in every institution. Know that microaggressions, if they continue, will create macro aggressions in society. To bring our own individual awareness so that we're not wearing blinders, and to acknowledge that those who speak up are courageous, to bring compassion to the work that we're doing, whatever it is, with whomever it is who's difficult or different from we. Be aware of the teaching opportunities we each have at church and community, with friends, to speak up with our own personal experiences and to not be intimidated because we each have a personal experience that's valuable, to believe that all lives matter, and to dive deeper into the trauma research and taking the time to listen deeply to others, to get involved in EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion work on a committee, in a library, wherever it is. And lastly, to look ourselves in the mirror every day, to love ourselves, because we can remember we are all one. What each of us does will impact others and build their resilience. It's a systems approach. And so we needn't despair or give up when we know it's going to take a long time and will not be over when we go to the grave.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, group number 6, Dusty and Laverne. Laverne, you can unmute.
Hello, and thank you. We had an interesting group and the pleasure of having Dr. Harrell with us. And we had a question and a statement. The central theme was around the impact of trauma on the next generation, the young people. Is it passed down? And how is it the young people now can deal with trauma in the school system or the criminal justice system? Their voices need to be heard and recognized so that they can make a difference for the future.
Thank you so much, Laverne. Our next group, number 7, Vicki and Wendy. And Vicki, you can unmute.
Thank you. And thank you to breakout room number 7 for the very insightful conversation. So one of the things that we felt most important is that there needs to be more education for Black and white, that when the white reality and the Black reality do not coincide, there's not going to be any solutions. And for so many white folks, and I think this, it was said for especially men, there is a sense of entitlement. There's a world view of white supremacy. And that's even when the white person may be aware of their privilege, that it's still there. The perspective is still there, not only with them, but with others, you know, thinking that they're superior and that their privilege is entitled. And for the Black perspective, it's just exhausting. It's a day-to-day living with this kind of trauma and dealing with it. It's just forever present. And it was said that it's hard to imagine when it doesn't exist or it won't exist anymore, because like someone else was saying, it's like an ongoing process that we have to work through. But through awareness, through education, we might have a shot.
Thank you, Vicki. And group number 7. Okay, group number 8 is Susan and Joe. And Susan, you can unmute.
Thank you. we had a quite, I think, interesting and warm and lively discussion. And of course, the time, there just wasn't enough time, and there never is. But the bottom lines and the takeaways that we came up with was this generational impact. All of us believe that this whole trauma continues to go generation to generation to generation. And that's actually quite disturbing to a lot of us. Much of it is because of this hierarchy of human value and hierarchy of racism, and getting to the bottom of that and to the root causes. One person, and I agree, felt very, very strongly about that. We even drilled down into our Calvert County, into how racism, how we have seen racism in Calvert County. The most concrete example, many of you on here will know about it, was the situation that happened at Calvert High School a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, and how that is maybe still impacting some of those students and people that were involved in that horrible, horrible incident, which we worked very hard to, through facilitations and to try to heal. Another comment that came out is the division that's even among the race. In other words, Blacks against Blacks, okay, and not accepting each other, and not being able to become part of a community. There were 4 of us that have been in this community for over 20 years, and we all agreed that there are still walls that need to come down. And the largest issue came back to what everyone is saying, and that is that we have to recognize this. We are obligated to educate, take our message out to others in our community, and be compassionate, and hope that we can continue the process of healing among others in our communities.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, we still have 5 more groups left, and I'm noting the time, so if facilitators could try and be as brief as possible so that we can end on time. Next is group number 9 with Heather and Cheryl. Heather, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. I want to thank everyone in group number 9 for sharing your experiences and sharing your questions and coming into dialogue with each other. I feel really grateful to have been a part of this group. And I have started my timer. So the themes that we came away with were thinking about sitting with that question of generational trauma and how that impacts all of us, and how that impacts how racism shows itself. We're also thinking about our younger generations and thinking about those who have come before us and how they taught us to love in the face of hate, and how can we also share that forward to younger generations now, and wanted to raise up that idea of understanding and sharing love among one another as ways to combat what we're presently facing, and also thinking about how the experiences of connection to the larger community and local businesses to help advance the cause of dismantling racism. And then finally, wanting to name how there are resources available locally to help us in those. And so we name those to each other.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, next is group number 10, which was my and Fred's group. So Fred, you can unmute and go ahead.
So group 10 was pretty focused on the idea that hate is taught. And so I think by consensus, there's a presumption that hate can be untaught. And so it's important to, I think, educate folks from a very early age about about both trauma as well as race and racism. That white people should be taught that everyone is a person, and that this is something that I think the group was generally sort of amazed and disappointed that it's still an issue, that we should be much further along. But I think that the solution that they saw going forward was the deeper education, better communication, better exchange, and more opportunities for whites to understand the circumstances surrounding racism and how that affects people of color.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, group number 11, Julie and Leslie. Julie, go ahead and unmute.
So I want to thank Group 11. They're very thoughtful and spoke from the heart. They came to an agreement that education in schools is vital. We need to equip our educators with training to be able to teach the students properly. We need to have a diverse history that's all year long, not just a month, and discuss all the contributions that people of color have made equally among people who are white that have made contributions. As we're teaching our students, we also need to have forums for the parents because they're going back to a culture at home and falling back into what's happening at home. So educating everyone. There was also a note that we are teaching math and social studies and what have you, but we also need to talk about and teach emotional connection between individuals and teach our young people to do that. And it was said that we all have a personal responsibility to work on how we connect with every individual we come across with.
Thanks, Julie. And moving on to group number 12, Laura, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you to group number 12, a group of very thoughtful individuals, and we were very lucky to have many diverse experiences. So what it boiled down to, Sherry, was how can we move out of this inertia on racial trauma issues, often identified as subtle and not overtly discussed, and that have been around for at least 40 years in folks' memories in this group. Not to say that there have not been gains, such as in workforce diversity, for example, particularly in schools, other public institutions, and healthcare, but these gains have not been easy to sustain, perhaps because of willingness, but not readiness to welcome and make these workplaces viable. And is part of the solution, we asked, does it lie in the engagement of and proactive involvement of the older and middle-aged generations of white persons in the community to speak up, get involved, educate themselves and educate one another, and not perceive it as someone else's issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And last, certainly not least, lucky group 13, Lori, go ahead.
Yes, lucky 13. Thank you to the entire group, and thank you to Mia Bowers for co-facilitating that with me. Like everybody, the two main themes in our group were about generational experiences and education. When it comes to generational experiences, that broke down a little bit with more detail, the economic disparity that has systematically taken place over generations, from building roads through Black and impoverished neighborhoods and redlining, and it just continues to create bigger economic disparity. We also talked about the generational trauma as it affects people physically and through the narratives and their stories. And something that was said that was so impactful was that every Black person has a story. Every Black person has a story. Not every white person can say that. And that sat with our group for a long time and was kind of woven through our discussion. The other piece was with education, needing that to start at home and knowing that some children still might struggle, right? Biracial children might have to choose a parent. Their language might be corrected at home as opposed to being in school. And so education and the narratives do start at home. We talked about the importance of community connection. But the other piece with education is that we've got to educate everyone on everything. You don't have to take a Black history class to understand our history. All of this happened on American soil. All of this is part of our history. Fear might drive why books are being pulled from libraries and school curriculums, but we really cannot make informed decisions without education. and then learning how to pull other people into the conversation. What do we do with this information now that we have it? And getting it back to the hands of those who can make decisions or change curriculums.
Thank you so much, Lori.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll turn things back over to Diane to finish up our program. Thank you so much,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and the facilitators and everybody in the small groups. This has been so valuable. And I've been trying desperately to take notes. I also want to thank Mike Schisler, who has been working hard on screen to summarize what each group has reported out. Thank you, Mike, for doing that. And we will, in our exit summary, share these points that you have made. 5 things for you to know before you go. 1, the exit survey is extremely important to us. It's the basis of what we use for our executive summary that goes out to the whole community. And we plan our next events, both us and our partners, based on what you say in the survey. You will be receiving that this evening. Please answer it. It's brief, and return it. When you return it, you get a bonus. We, the Big Conversation Steering Committee, in our year's work, created a trauma guide, a resource guide to trauma. And we will send that out to you when we receive your survey. I also encourage you to watch for coming events, not only from us, but from the partners. I want to highlight a couple. Calvert Library is Johnny on the Spot, and they have several events coming up based on One Maryland, One Book program. And one of the ones that they will be doing, I can't say it because I'm blurred, is that they will be doing a discussion of One Maryland, One Book, What's Mine and Yours. And that's coming up. There is also writing seminars coming up for those of you who learn better or think things out better by writing. But go to their events page, both St. Mary's and Calvert and Charles, because they're all offering things. How do you get in touch with us? Our email and our website are in the program. So you can give us more feedback if you wish, or any time in the year if you want to communicate with us, please use them. And finally, and most important, the thank yous. I want to thank our 25 partners who make this possible. Our panelists, Dr. Jules Harrell and Dr. Washington, Kevin Washington, thank you. This was a rich, wonderful, big conversation because of what you brought to us. You brought the foundation, and our people really take off with it. I want to thank the 26 facilitators who were our mediation people, and Dusty Rose for organizing them. Sherry, thank you for the closing. A special thanks to Robin Truslow and Calvert Library. We would not be able to broadcast this without both of them. And we thank you very much. Robin, you put in far too much work than people realize, but it's very important, and we thank you for your efforts. To the Big Conversation Steering Committee, you have worked for a whole year to make this possible. Thank you for your dedication to the community, to justice, and for seeking the beloved community where all will prosper. And to you participants, we thank you. There were 250 plus who registered. We have hoped you have had the opportunity to participate. The conversation is not possible without you. But together, we will achieve understanding, healing, justice, and equity. I'm going to leave you with one quote that is a theme that I've heard over and over today. It's from Martin Luther King, who said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Don't be silent. We look forward to the next big conversation or our smaller events with you. Have a nice evening and thank you for your participation.